She was beaten and left for dead until a quiet cowboy took her in and gave her a new name. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be reborn? Subscribe now to experience more powerful stories of redemption and second chances in the Wild West. The blood trickled down her face, warm and sticky against her skin that had grown cold in the autumn night. Sarah couldn't remember how long she'd been lying there on the edge of the dusty trail, her body curled into itself like a wounded animal. The boot prints around her told a story she couldn't fully piece together. Only fragments remained in her battered mind. Her father's rage, her brothers holding her down, the burning pain as fists and boots connected with her body. Disgrace. They had called her liar, thief. None of it was true, but truth meant little to men whose minds had been poisoned by whiskey and rumors from town. She had taken nothing but what was rightfully hers, her mother's locket, the only thing left of the woman who had died bringing her into this cruel world. But when her father discovered it missing from the lockbox, he'd assumed she'd stolen it to sell for passage out of Eagle Creek. Sarah tried to move, but her ribs screamed in protest. Night was falling fast across the Montana Territory, and with it came the biting cold of early October. She knew what waited for her in these hills after dark coyotes first, then wolves if she was unlucky. The thought didn't frighten her as much as it should have. Perhaps it would be a mercy. She closed her eyes, feeling consciousness slipping away when the distant sound of hoofbeats stirred her. Someone was coming. Sarah tried to call out, but her swollen lips and parched throat produced nothing more than a faint whimper. The rider would pass her by. They always did in these parts. People minded their own business if they wanted to stay alive. The hoofbeats slowed, then stopped altogether. Through blood-crusted eyelashes, she saw dust swirling around the legs of a chestnut horse. A man dismounted, his spurs jingling softly as boots hit the ground. She braced herself, wondering if this stranger had come to finish what her family had started. Instead, a gentle hand brushed the matted hair from her face. Sarah flinched. "Easy now," came a quiet voice, deep but soft like distant thunder. "I ain't gonna hurt you." She forced her eyes open wider to look at him. He wasn't young lines etched around eyes that had seen too much sun and hardship. His face was weathered beneath a wide-brimmed hat with a neatly trimmed beard speckled with gray. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, blue, like the summer sky, and filled with something she hadn't seen directed at her in years. Kindness. "Can you stand?" he asked, his gaze taking in her injuries with a grim expression. Sarah tried to shake her head, but even that small movement sent pain shooting down her spine. The man seemed to understand without words. He shrugged off his coat and carefully draped it over her trembling form. "I'm gonna pick you up now," he said. "My ranch is about an hour's ride from here. Got supplies there to tend those wounds." Before she could protest, not that she had the strength to, he was lifting her as gently as a newborn calf, cradling her broken body against his chest. Pain was immediate and overwhelming, but the warmth of another human being, one who wasn't trying to harm her, felt like a miracle. "Name's Thomas Blackwood," he said as he mounted his horse with surprising grace, keeping her secure in his arms. "Most folks just call me Tom." She tried to speak her name, but blood bubbled at the corner of her mouth, and darkness began to close in again. "Don't you worry about talking now," he murmured. "Just hold on." The steady rhythm of the horse's gait and the solid beat of the stranger's heart against her ear lulled Sarah into unconsciousness. For the first time in years, she surrendered without fear. When she woke, she was lying on something soft, a real bed with clean linens that smelled of soap and sunshine. A small fire crackled in a stone hearth, casting flickering shadows across unfamiliar walls. She tried to move and immediately regretted it. "I wouldn't do that just yet," came that same quiet voice from before. Sarah turned her head slowly to see Thomas Blackwood sitting in a chair beside the bed, whittling what appeared to be a small wooden horse. "You've got 3 broken ribs, Pye." "My count," he continued, setting down his carving. "Cut on your head needed stitching. Rest is mostly bruising, though plenty bad enough." She opened her mouth to speak, but her throat felt like she'd swallowed sand. "Here," he said, reaching for a cup of water on the bedside table. With gentle hands, he supported her head as she drank greedily. "Thank you," she finally managed, her voice barely a whisper. Tom nodded, settling back in his chair. "Been tending to you for 2 days now. Fever broke this morning." 2 days? She'd lost that much time? Panic surged through her. If her father found out where she was. "Nobody's coming for you," Tom said, reading the fear in her eyes. "Not past my property line, anyhow. You don't know my father," she whispered. "Don't need to," he replied with quiet confidence. "I know my reputation." There was something in the way he said it, not boastful, just matter of fact, that made her believe him. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked after a moment of silence. She hesitated. Her name belonged to her family, to the men who had left her for dead. "Sarah," she finally said. "Sarah Miller." Tom nodded slowly, considering this. "Well, Sarah Miller, whoever did this to you, they believe you're dead. Might be best to keep it that way." A chill ran through her that had nothing to do with her injuries. "What do you mean?" "Mean you might need a new name, new start." His eyes were steady on hers. "The woman they tried to kill on that trail? She's gone. Who you become now, that's up to you." The simple truth of his words struck her like physical force. She wasn't Sarah Miller anymore. That girl had died on the trail. "Rest now," Tom said, rising from his chair. "We can talk more when you're stronger." As he turned to leave, she called out, her voice stronger than before. "Why? Why help me?" Tom paused in the doorway, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the light from the next room. He seemed to consider his answer carefully. "Found my wife. The same way, 20 years back," he said softly. "Someone beat her and left her for the wolves. Difference is, I found her too late." He looked back at her, his blue eyes holding a pain that time hadn't dulled. "Maybe saving you makes up for not being there in time for her." With that, he closed the door gently behind him, leaving her alone with his words and the crackling fire. As she drifted back to sleep, Sarah realized that for the first time in her life, she was truly safe. The following days passed in a rhythm of healing and quiet conversation. Tom's ranch was modest, but well kept, a sturdy main house with a barn and corral nestled in a valley protected by rolling hills. He lived alone, she learned, apart from an aging cattle dog named Buck, who had taken to sleeping at the foot of her bed as her strength returned. Sarah began to piece together the man who had saved her life. Thomas Blackwood had been a Texas Ranger before coming to Montana, though he offered few details about those years. He ran a small but successful cattle operation, respected in the nearest town of Clearwater for his fair dealings, and feared enough that trouble gave his land a wide berth. One morning, after she'd managed to dress herself in clothes he'd procured from town, simple but well-made dresses and practical boots, Sarah found Tom on the front porch, sipping coffee as dawn broke over the eastern hills. "Morning," he said, offering her a steaming cup as she eased herself onto the bench beside him. They sat in companionable silence, watching the sun paint the landscape in hues of gold and amber. Sarah had never known such peace. "I can't stay forever," she finally said, though the words hurt almost as much as her healing ribs. "I should move on soon." Tom's eyes remained fixed on the distant hills. Where would you go? The question hung in the air between them. In truth, she had nowhere. No family that didn't wish her harm. no friends who would risk sheltering her. "I could work," she offered. "I'm good with numbers. I can read and write better than most. My mother taught me." Before. She stopped, the memory still raw even after 12 years. "Ranch needs tending," Tom said after a while. "Books need keeping. Been doing it myself, but I'm better with cattle than columns of figures." Hope flickered within her, fragile as a candle flame. "Are you offering me a job, Mr. Blackwood?" "Tom." He corrected gently. "And yes, reckon I am. Room and board plus wages. You'd have your own cabin once you're healed up proper old foreman's place down by the creek. Been empty for years, but it's sound." She studied his profile, searching for hidden meaning or expectations in his offer. She found none, just the same steady kindness that had been there since he'd found her. "Why would you trust me? You don't know anything about me." Tom turned to face her then, his expression serious. "Know enough. Know you survived what would have. Killed most. Know you haven't complained once despite the pain. Know you're scared but hiding it well." He paused. "And I know what it's like to need a second chance." Tears welled in her eyes before she could stop them. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, turning back to the sunrise. "But you'll need a new name, like I said. Can't have Sarah Miller working. At Blackwood Ranch. Word travels." She thought about it, about who she wanted to become in this new life she'd been granted. "Grace," she said finally. "I'd like to be called Grace." A small smile tugged at the corner of Tom's mouth. "Seems fitting." "Grace what?" For a moment she hesitated. Then, with courage she didn't know she possessed, she said, "Grace Blackwood." "Your sister, perhaps? Recently widowed?" If he was surprised by her boldness, he didn't show it. Instead, he nodded slowly, considering the story. "Sister-in-law," he amended. "My brother's widow from back east. Come to start fresh after his. Passing. Will people believe that?" "They'll believe what I tell them," he said simply. "Besides, folks around here know better than to ask too many questions of Tom Blackwood." There it was again, that hint of a reputation beyond the quiet rancher sitting beside her. She wondered what stories lay buried beneath his calm exterior. Then, "It's settled," he said, rising to his feet. "Grace Blackwood, welcome to your new home." As Serenelle Grace watched the sun rise fully over the Montana hills, she felt something bloom inside her that she had thought long dead. Hope. Subscribe. And hit the notification bell if you want to hear more stories of second chances, healing, and unexpected connections in the Wild West. In Chapter 2, we'll discover how Grace adjusts to her new identity and the looming danger that threatens her newfound peace. If you're enjoying this journey of redemption and new beginnings, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful Wild West stories that will touch your heart. The town of Clearwater was smaller than Grace had imagined, just a single street of weathered buildings huddled together against the vast Montana landscape. As Tom guided the wagon past the livery stable and general store, she felt exposed despite the new bonnet shielding her face. Her hands, still bearing faded bruises, clutched nervously at her skirts. "Relax," Tom said quietly. "You look nothing like the girl they left on that trail." He was right. The woman who stared back at Grace from Tom's shaving mirror each morning barely resembled Sarah Miller. 3 weeks of proper meals had filled out her once gaunt face. Her dark hair, washed and trimmed, now hung in neat waves beneath her bonnet, instead of the matted tangles it had been. And there was something else, a dignity in her posture that hadn't been there before, a quiet confidence born of safety. "Mrs. Jenkins at the general store can be nosy," Tom warned as he pulled the wagon to a stop. "Let me do most of the talking." Grace nodded, taking a deep breath as he helped her down from the wagon. Her ribs still ached with certain movements, but the worst of her injuries had healed. They entered the store, a bell jingling above the door to announce their arrival. The store smelled of coffee, leather, and dried goods, a comforting mix that reminded Grace of better days in her childhood. A plump woman with graying hair, pinned severely back, looked up from her ledger. "Thomas Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying a hint of surprise. "Twice in 1 month. Must be some kind of record." "Afternoon, Mrs. Jenkins," Tom replied with a polite nod. "Just need a few things today." The woman's curious gaze shifted to Grace, who straightened her shoulders despite her nervousness. "And who might this be?" Mrs. Jenkins asked, making no effort to hide her interest. "This is my late brother's widow, Grace Blackwood," Tom said smoothly. "Come from back east to make a fresh start." "I didn't know you had a brother," Mrs. Jenkins said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Never had much reason to talk about him," Tom replied, his tone making it clear the subject wasn't open for discussion. Mrs. Jenkins seemed to accept this, her expression softening as she turned to Grace. "Well, my condolences, Mrs. Blackwood. Must be quite an adjustment, coming out to these parts after city living." Grace found her voice, adopting the gentle accent Tom had coached her on, nothing like the frontier drawl of Eagle Creek. "It's been a change, ma'am, but a welcome one. Thomas has been most kind." "I'm sure he has," Mrs. Jenkins replied with a knowing look that made Grace's cheeks flush. "Will you be staying long?" "Grace is taking over the bookkeeping at the ranch," Tom interjected. "And she'll be here permanently." A flash of something disappointment crossed Mrs. Jenkins' face. "I see. Well, what can I help you with today?" As Tom listed the supplies they needed, Grace wandered the store, running her fingers over bolts of fabric and jars of candy. It had been years since she'd been in a proper store without her father's looming presence, dictating what she could and couldn't touch. "Grace," Tom called, "anything you need while we're here?" The simple question, the acknowledgement of her wants, caught her off guard. "Perhaps some fabric?" she asked tentatively. "For curtains in the cabin?" Tom nodded. "Get whatever you like." With Mrs. Jenkins' assistance, Grace selected a cheerful floral print and some plain muslin for linings. Tom added them to their order without comment, along with the sewing kit she hadn't asked for, but clearly needed as they were preparing to leave. The store bell jingled again. Grace turned to see 3 men enter, trail-worn cowboys with dust on, their boots and hands that moved too readily toward their belts. The lead man, tall with a scar running through his left eyebrow, stopped short when he spotted Tom. "Blackwood," he said, the name carrying the weight of recognition. Tom nodded curtly. "Reynolds." An uncomfortable silence filled the store. Grace could feel tension radiating from Tom, though his posture remained relaxed. "Heard you lost some cattle last month," Reynolds said, a hint of something ugly beneath his casual tone. "Did I?" Tom replied coolly. "That's the word in Broken Pine," Reynolds shrugged. "Thought you should know." "Appreciate the concern," Tom said, though it was clear from his tone that he didn't believe the man's intentions were good. "Mrs. Jenkins, we'll collect our order this afternoon." He placed a protective hand at the small of Grace's back, guiding her toward the door. She could feel Reynolds' eyes following them, assessing, calculating. Outside, Tom helped her into the wagon with more haste than usual. "Who was that?" she asked once they were moving down the street. "Trouble," Tom replied simply. "Jack Reynolds. Runs a crew over at the Broken Horn Ranch. Been pushing boundaries lately, literal and figurative." "He seemed to know you?" Tom's jaw tightened. "Most men in 3 territories know me, Grace. Part of why you're safe at my ranch." There it was again, a hint of a past beyond the quiet rancher she knew. "From your ranger days?" she ventured. He nodded once, but offered nothing more. They completed their errands in town, quickly stopping at the feed store and the blacksmith before collecting their order from Mrs. Jenkins. Grace noticed how people greeted Tom with respect, but kept their distance, conversations clipped and purposeful. By the time they were heading back to the ranch, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains. "You did well today," Tom said as the wagon rumbled along the trail. "Mrs. Jenkins will have the story all over town by sundown." "Is that good or bad?" "Good. Best way to establish a story is to let the town gossips do the work for you." Grace smiled, then sobered as she thought of Reynolds and his men. "Those men, should I be worried?" Tom was silent for a long moment. "Not right now. But it's best you learn to handle a firearm. Living on a ranch, it's a necessary skill." Fear twisted in her stomach. "I'll teach you," he interrupted gently. "Not asking you to become a gunslinger, Grace. Just to protect yourself if needed." The idea terrified her. Guns had only ever meant violence in her experience, but she trusted Tom's judgment. "All right," she agreed quietly. They rode in companionable silence as the ranch came into view. In the 3 weeks since she'd arrived, Grace had come to see its beauty, the way the evening light bathed the buildings in gold, the peaceful grazing of cattle in the distance, the clarity of the creek that ran along the property's eastern edge. "I finished clearing out the cabin yesterday," Tom said as they approached. "It's ready whenever you are." Grace felt a pang of something like disappointment. She had grown accustomed to the security of the main house, to Buck's warm presence. At her feet, to the quiet sounds of Tom moving about in the evenings. "Unless you'd prefer to stay in the main house longer," he added, as if reading her thoughts. "No rush." "The cabin would be more proper," she said hesitantly. Tom's hands tightened slightly on the reins. "Proper doesn't keep you warm at night." "Grace, or safe." The simple truth of his words settled between them. This wasn't about propriety. It was about security. About the nightmares that still woke her gasping for breath, believing she was back on that trail with her life bleeding into the dirt. "Perhaps a few more days in the main house," she conceded. "Until I'm more settled." He nodded, a hint of relief in his expression. Wise decision. The following morning, Tom took her to a small clearing behind the barn, a row of bottles set up on a fallen log at the far end. In his hands was a polished revolver, smaller than the one he carried on his hip. "This was my wife's," he said, holding it out to her. "Proper size for a woman's hand." Grace took it hesitantly, surprised by its weight. Did she use it often? A shadow crossed Tom's face. Not often enough. He positioned himself behind her, adjusting her stance with gentle hands on her shoulders. "Respect it, but don't fear it," he said close to her ear. "It's just a tool, like any other." For the next hour, he taught her the basics, how to load and unload, how to aim, how to control her breathing. When she finally pulled the trigger for the first time, the sound made her jump despite his warnings. The bullet went wild, missing the bottles completely. "Again," he encouraged. "This time, keep your eyes open." By the end of the session, she had managed to hit 2 bottles, and the gun felt less foreign in her hands. "We'll practice every day," Tom said as they walked back to the house. "You're a quick learner." His praise warmed her more than it should have. In the weeks since he'd found her, Grace had developed feelings for the quiet rancher that went beyond gratitude. She knew it was foolish. He saw her as someone to protect, perhaps as a substitute for the wife he couldn't save. Nothing more. As the days turned to weeks, Grace settled into life at Blackwood Ranch. The cabin by the creek became her home, filled with small touches that made it hers curtains from the fabric she'd bought in town, wildflowers in jars on the windowsills, a braided rug she'd made from scraps. Each evening, she joined Tom for dinner in the main house, where they would discuss the day's business before he escorted her back to the cabin. Her skill with numbers proved valuable. She discovered discrepancies in the ranch ledgers that had been costing Tom money for years. With her careful management, they were able to order additional supplies and even hire 2 young cowboys to help with the increasing herd. Life developed a peaceful rhythm until the day 3 months later when a rider appeared on the ridge above the ranch, silhouetted against the winter sky. Grace was hanging laundry when she spotted him, and something in his posture sent ice through her veins. Tom emerged from the barn, rifle in hand, and called to her, "Get inside, now." She obeyed, hurrying to the main house where she watched through the window as the rider approached. It wasn't Reynolds or his men. This was someone different. Someone who sat a horse the way her father did. Leaning slightly forward with impatient authority, Tom met the rider in the yard, their conversation too distant for Grace to hear. But she saw the way Tom's stance changed, becoming more rigid, more defensive. After several minutes, the rider turned his horse and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. When Tom entered the house, his expression was grave. "Pack your things?" he said without preamble. "Just what you need for a few days." Fear clutched at her heart. "What's happening? Who was that?" "Marshall from over Eagle Creek Way," Tom replied, already moving to collect his own essentials. "Seems there's a rumor going around about a rancher harboring a fugitive." The room seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "They know I'm alive?" "They suspect," he corrected, pausing to look at her. "Someone matching your description was seen in Clearwater. Your father's put out a reward." "A reward?" The idea was absurd. "For what crime?" "Theft, he claims. Says you stole family heirlooms before running off." Tom's expression darkened. Marshall seemed skeptical, but he's obligated to investigate. Grace sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. "He'll never stop looking for me, will he?" Tom knelt before her, taking her trembling hands in his. "Listen to me, Grace. No one's taking you anywhere. I've sent for some help, an old friend who owes me a favor. We just need to lie low for a few days." "Where?" "Line cabin up in the north pasture. Remote. Few people know it exists." She nodded, trusting him, completely despite her fear. "When do we leave?" "Now. Before that Marshall has second thoughts and comes back with questions I don't want to answer." Within the hour, they were riding north, Grace on Tom's spare horse and Buck following behind. The line cabin was a half-day's journey, tucked into a stand of pines that offered shelter from the harsh winter winds. As they rode, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that her past was closing in on her, threatening to destroy the peace she had found. "Tom," she said as they paused to rest the horses beside a frozen creek, "I never stole anything. Just my mother's locket, and it was mine by right." He looked at her, his blue eyes steady. "I know. If they find me, they won't," he interrupted firmly. "And even if they did, no court would convict you. Not with the state you were in when I found you." She wasn't so sure. Her father had influence in Eagle Creek money and connections that could twist justice to his will. But she didn't say this aloud, not wanting to add to Tom's burden. They reached the line cabin as dusk was falling, the small structure barely visible among the pines. It was simple but solid, a single room with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn furniture, and supplies for emergencies. As Tom lit the fire and lamps, the space became almost cozy despite the circumstances. "It's not much," he apologized, "but it'll keep us warm until this blows over." "It's perfect," she assured him, grateful for his protection. That night, as wind howled outside and snow began to fall, they sat before the fire eating a simple meal of beans and jerky. Grace couldn't help but notice how the flickering light softened Tom's weathered features, highlighting the kindness in his eyes. "Tell me about your wife," she said suddenly, surprising herself with her boldness. Tom was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, softly, her name was Rebecca. She was a school teacher before we married, smart as they come, and kind too. He stared into the flames. Had the same color hair as you. How did she die? Grace asked gently. Her brother owed money to the wrong people. When he couldn't pay, they came for her instead. His voice hardened. I was tracking rustlers 2 counties over. By the time I got home, ... He trailed off, the rest of the story written in the pain etched across his face. I'm sorry, Grace whispered. I tracked every last one of them down, he continued, his voice distant. That's how I got my reputation. Not proud of it, but can't say I regret it either. In that moment, Grace understood the man before her in a way she hadn't before: his quiet strength, his fierce protectiveness, the respect tinged with fear that people showed him in town. He had transformed his grief into something dangerous, something that now sheltered her from harm. Thank you, she said, for telling me, for everything. His eyes met hers across the small space, something unspoken passing between them. Get some rest, he said finally. I'll take first watch. Grace curled up on the narrow bed, wrapped in blankets that smelled of pine and wood smoke. As she drifted toward sleep, she realized that despite the danger, despite the uncertainty of what tomorrow might bring, she felt safe, protected, and something else, something she wasn't ready to name, but that warmed her from within, like the cabin's glowing hearth dot outside. The snow continued to fall, covering their tracks and wrapping the cabin in a blanket of white silence. If you want to find out what happens when Grace's past catches up to her, and whether Tom can protect her from those who would drag her back to her old life, be sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon for notifications. Chapter 3 awaits with revelations, confrontations, and a moment that will change everything for our quiet cowboy and the woman he saved. Thank you for joining us for another chapter of this moving Wild West journey. If you're enjoying Grace and Tom's story, please hit like and subscribe to support our channel and never miss a new story. 3 days passed in the quiet seclusion of the line cabin. Grace and Tom fell into an easy routine. He would hunt for fresh meat in the mornings while she tended the cabin. Then they would spend the afternoons playing cards or reading from the few dog-eared books stored on a shelf by the fireplace. In the evenings, they really talked in a way Grace had never experienced with anyone. Tom told her of his years as a Texas Ranger, of the loneliness that had followed him north to Montana after Rebecca's death, of the peace he'd finally found in the rhythm of ranch life. In turn, Grace shared stories of her childhood before her mother's death, of the dreams she'd once had of becoming a teacher, of the gradual descent into cruelty that had marked her father's household after her mother was gone. He wasn't always like that, she confessed one evening as they sat side by side on the cabin's small porch, watching the sunset paint the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. There was kindness in him once. My mother's death changed him. Grief does strange things to a man, Tom acknowledged. But it doesn't excuse what he did to you. No, she agreed softly, it doesn't. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the occasional snap of the burning wood in the fireplace behind them. Buck lay at their feet, his tail thumping lazily against the wooden planks. I keep thinking about what happens after this, Grace said finally. If the marshal believes my father, if they come looking here ... My friend will be at the ranch by now, Tom reassured her. Former ranger best tracker I ever knew. If anyone can throw them off your trail, it's him. She nodded, wanting to believe him. And if he can't? Tom's hand found hers in the fading light, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. Then we'll go somewhere they can't find us. Colorado, maybe. Or further west to Oregon. The "we" in his statement caught her by surprise. You would leave your ranch? Everything you've built?" He turned to look at her, his blue eyes serious in the twilight. "A ranch is just land and buildings, Grace. Can build another somewhere else." Her heart stuttered in her chest at the implication of his words. Before she could respond, Buck's head lifted suddenly, his ears pricked forward in alert. A low growl rumbled in his throat. Tom was on his feet instantly, hand moving to the revolver at his hip. "Get inside," he said quietly. Grace obeyed, slipping through the door as Tom stepped off the porch, scanning the tree line. Through the window, she watched him move cautiously toward the edge of the clearing, Buck at his heels. The dog's behavior had changed from alertness to recognition, his tail now wagging as a figure emerged from the trees. Relief flooded through Grace as she recognized the distinctive hat and posture of the man approaching. Daniel Carter, one of the young cowboys Tom had hired to help at the ranch. Tom's stance relaxed as well, though she noted he didn't remove his hand from his weapon until Daniel was close enough to speak. Their conversation was brief. Tom nodded several times, his expression growing more serious with each passing moment. Finally, he gestured toward the cabin, and Daniel followed him inside. "Miss Grace," Daniel greeted her, removing his hat. At 19, he was the younger of the two hands Tom had hired, eager to prove himself and unfailingly polite. "Daniel," she replied with a nod. "Is everything all right at the ranch?" The young man glanced at Tom, who gave a slight nod. "Ranch is fine, ma'am," Daniel said, "but there's been some developments in town. Marshall's been asking questions, showing your description around." Fear coiled in her stomach. "Has anyone recognized me?" "Not directly," Tom interjected, "but Mrs. Jenkins mentioned my sister-in-law to him. He's suspicious enough to want to speak with you personally." "That's not all," Daniel added hesitantly. "Jim was in Clearwater yesterday. Said he saw some men asking about you too, not lawmen. Rough types." Tom's expression darkened. "Bounty hunters?" Daniel nodded. "Most likely. Jim heard your father's offering $500 for information leading to your return." "500?" Grace whispered, sinking into a chair. It was an enormous sum, enough to tempt even honest men, let alone the kind who tracked people for money. "There's more," Daniel continued reluctantly. "One of them big fella with a scar through his eyebrow." "Reynolds," Tom growled. "Yes, sir. He was telling folks he knew where to find you. Said he'd seen you in town with Mr. Blackwood." The implications hung heavy in the air. Reynolds had recognized her that day in the general store, had somehow connected her to Sarah Miller. Tom paced the small cabin, his mind clearly working through their options. "Daniel, did Jim see where Reynolds and his men were headed?" "Back toward Broken Pine last night, but they were talking about riding out at first light. Heading this way, Jim thought." Tom checked his pocket watch. They could be at the ranch by midday tomorrow if they pushed their horses. He turned to Grace. "We need to move." "To where?" she asked, panic rising in her throat. "If they're already looking in this direction." "West," Tom decided, "through the high country. There's another cabin beyond Miller's Ridge Trappers. Place I bought years back. Remote enough that few know about it. I can create a false trail," Daniel offered. "Lead them north toward the Blackfoot Reservation." Tom clasped the young man's shoulder. "Good man. But be careful, Reynolds isn't known for asking questions before shooting." Daniel nodded solemnly. "What about the marshal?" "Keep him occupied at the ranch if he returns. Tell him I've gone to Helena on business. Took my sister-in-law with me." Tom moved to the corner of the cabin, retrieving a hidden strongbox from beneath a floorboard. Inside was a substantial amount of cash, which he divided, handing a portion to Daniel. "For your troubles," he explained. "There's more waiting if you and Jim keep things running until we return." "Yes, sir," Daniel replied, tucking the money into his vest. "When should we expect you back?" Tom and Grace exchanged a look. Hard, too. Say, Tom answered. Might be a week, might be longer. After Daniel departed with instructions to create false trails and maintain the ranch in their absence, Tom and Grace prepared to leave at first light. They packed supplies, cleaned the cabin, to remove evidence of their